As the last speaker, I could use all of my time commenting on what's been said so far, but I'll have to try to resist that temptation because it would leave me no time to put forward positively what I stand for. What I stand for is very different from what I've heard for the past 2.5 hours. Very different. And I have wished to have the opportunity to provoke some debate here. There hasn't been enough debate, I think. But the format doesn't lend itself to it. So I'll make the best of that situation. If I can convince everyone here or anyone here to seriously investigate the subject of the socialist alternative to capitalism that I intend to sort of speak about in the few minutes that I have allotted, and above all, read the World Socialist website, the most widely read socialist online publication in the world. And it's the World Socialist website. World. I've heard almost nothing about that in the past 2.5 hours. That we are in an international struggle. And it makes me angry to see that that is so far from the understanding of young people today. What is posed today, not only in the United States, but all over the world, is the need for the revival and development of Marxism. The application of the scientific method and concepts of the Marxist movement to a world which has been vastly transformed even in the last 30 years, let alone the period of about 150 years ago, during which Marx and Engels made their world-shaking discoveries. What is needed is a scientific analysis not only of the current economic, social, and political situation, but inseparably from that analysis, drawing the historical lessons of the struggle for socialism, particularly in the 20th century. We meet at a time of the greatest economic crisis in the lives of you or your parents, both. Of course, as has been said before, you've got to go back to the 1930s, and in some respects, the current crisis is greater than the one in the 1930s. The global crisis is characterized by a growing threat of war. In the past decade, also something that no one has seen fit to say anything about in today's presentations. Afghanistan, pardon me, there was a brief mention in the last presentation of the 1.3 billion victims. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya just a few months ago. And now the beating the war drums against Iran. Throughout the world, the United States is increasingly and correctly regarded as an outlaw state, using its unprecedented military superiority in a desperate attempt to compensate for its declining economic power. That is the world in which we're living. Not these abstract, very abstract theorizing and play acting about different ideas and schemes and utopias. The class struggle is a term which may be somewhat mysterious to many of you. It has been pretty much buried in the media and the universities, but it hasn't been buried in the real world. We are emerging from a period of some decades in which the class struggle was largely hidden, but it never disappeared, and today no one can any longer pretend it does not exist. Although, frankly, I think there are a few people here who are trying to pretend it does not exist. One mention of Occupy Wall Street in 2.5 hours. I have put a challenge to everyone here. What kind of radicalism is that? And why? I mean, I wasn't expecting that. My anger is spontaneous. There's something wrong, and we should examine it. Not because I think Occupy Wall Street is some manna from heaven that's going to solve all our problems. Far from it. But it's a symptom of something going on in the real world outside of this auditorium. And we have to think about those questions. Let me speak very briefly with the differences between revolutionary Marxism and the trends that are discussed in the program. There's a difference between radicalism and revolution. In some ways, I can describe myself as a radical. There is a proud radical tradition in the United States and elsewhere. Yes, but it's not the same as revolution. The radical sees injustice and protests it. The revolutionist sees the means of overcoming this injustice through the struggle of the masses. It's different. You may not agree. You may think that revolution leads to counter-revolution all the time, leads to dictatorship, and we should not embrace it, but that's the difference. The utopian also protests, but has absolutely no proposals on how to get from here to there. The Marxist, as I said, understands the cause of the injustice and how it can be overcome. Today's global economic crisis, without parallel except for the 1930s, and even in some ways more of a global crisis than that one, is ushering in what can only be called a pre-revolutionary period. In the world, in 1848, there were revolutions simultaneously. I don't think it's an exaggeration to point to the 1,000 cities which saw protests on October 15th, this past October 15th as part of the Occupy movement. The ruling class can no longer rule in the old way, and the working class can no longer live in the old way. Those are the major ingredients of what a Marxist would call a pre-revolutionary situation. The contending classes increasingly find the status quo unacceptable and intolerable, but from, of course, very different standpoints. The ruling class prefers what socialists call bourgeois democracy to dictatorship. It prefers to rule in a democratic fashion. Why? First of all, it provides for the widest and freest debate within the ruling class itself on the best policies to defend its interests. But it also creates conditions of relative stability, convinces large sections of the working class that it has a stake in the system. What did Howard Schultz say last week, the CEO of Starbucks? We should be very concerned about social inequality because it's going to lead to struggle, to upheaval in this country. And he is, of course, a leading capitalist who's concerned about it. And he's not the only one. All of this has generally been the case for the past 50 or 60 years, but it wasn't the case before, that is, ruling in this democratic fashion. And it is increasingly becoming impossible today. As Floyd Norris pointed out in the New York Times a few days ago, he's one of their economics correspondents, the very idea that the Greek population should have the right to vote on austerity policies was completely unacceptable to the bankers and their spokesmen in the European Union, the prime ministers, of course, of France and Germany and so forth. And they read the riot act of Papandreou, and the Greek prime minister announced within 24 hours that there would be no referendum. Working people can no longer live in the old way. For decades, and indeed for generations, the defenders of the status quo have declared that the vast majority of the population are apathetic and will never get involved in politics. How many times have you heard that? My concern is that most of you seem to agree with it, and I think it's totally wrong. It is true that most working people aren't involved most of the time. They're too busy worrying about the pressures of everyday life, and they don't see how political activity can improve their conditions. Here in the U.S., this has been reflected in the steadily declining voter participation of recent decades. If it is 50% overall for most elections, it is 20 to 25% in many of the poorest neighborhoods. A shocking indictment of the system in and of itself. Meanwhile, bread and circuses, as in the case of previous empires, are used to keep the masses quiet, even if they don't bother to vote. Voter abstention is not simply apathy, however. It contains a good dose of anger and disgust as well. What happens when the bread disappears? It's disappearing as we speak. Working people thought they had a social contract in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere in the developed world in particular. Jobs, education, healthcare, and other social services, and pensions. All of these are now being ripped up with no end in sight. This is what creates the conditions in which votes may be dangerous, as in Greece, in which, for instance, I don't know how many are aware of it. The Republican right is leading the way, but the Democrats are putting up very little resistance as usual to various attempts in states all over the country to institute photo IDs. So there'll be even less votes. They want 10% of the poor to vote. It's back to pre-1789 France. What has to happen for people to see that this is a situation full of revolutionary implications? Wake up! The war between the Republicans and Democrats over such issues as the debt limit this past summer reflects the insoluble crisis of the capitalist system. The bitter arguments mask, and to some extent are designed to mask, fundamental agreement between these parties that the so-called entitlement programs, Medicare, Social Security, and more must be smashed to smithereens because American capitalism is bankrupt. What are the differences between Obama and Boehner on that? There are none. None whatsoever. They only are maneuvering over who's going to take the fall, who's going to take the blame. Like in Greece, they're arguing what the opposition, right-wing opposition, wants to get into the government. So they're opposed to the same austerity policies on that ground, and only on that ground, that their counterparts in Europe are the ones who are imposing on the Greek population. So it's 95% posturing and maneuvers of that sort. All the old contradictions and unresolved questions, so to speak, left over from the 20th century are back with a vengeance today. Rapidly worsening social conditions, poverty, inequality, insecurity, the growing dangers of war and dictatorship, with the Obama administration following Bush with its policies of drone killings, targeted assassinations of U.S. citizens, war on numerous fronts, and so forth. Who would have thought in 2008 that that would be the situation we're facing? Well, I'll tell you, the Socialist Equality Party thought it, but we were alone in mourning about that. And we think that it's time to draw some conclusions. And we know that millions are beginning to draw some conclusions about that. Whatever may be said about the Occupy Wall Street movement and its limitations, and they are many, they're not about to go out and campaign for Obama. They're not crazy. They're not going to do it again in 2012. Not the people who have been motivated in their some thousands, not yet millions, but thousands, to just camp out and so forth, to call attention to the obscene inequality and other social problems in America and the rest of the world. In this past year, the final piece of the puzzle of the revolutionary perspective of what I maintain is an accurate scientific perspective of what we are facing in the coming years. This final piece of the puzzle has begun to emerge, the working class on an international scale. From Egypt in the first month of 2011 to America and everywhere in between. This marks the end of a long period of relative quiescence which led apologists for the status quo to announce the disappearance of the working class, to announce that the fundamental dividing lines in society were those between race and gender and sexuality, and not class, or maybe a little bit of class, some remnant lying out there, instead of that being the fundamental issue in society. And it is. And this is the significance, I believe, of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Begun less than 2 months ago in New York, grew into a movement encompassing hundreds of cities worldwide and more than 1,000 simultaneous actions on October 15th. The response of the New York Times and other newspapers of record was to completely ignore this for the first week of its existence. Then, when they found that they could no longer ignore it, they tried to embrace it, and along with numerous Democratic politicians and union officials, portray it simply as the organizational expression of the opinions of the left wing of the establishment. People like Paul Krugman of the New York Times. Now, supposedly, Occupy Wall Street is really fighting for a little legislation in Washington that will tighten regulation.